December 1745. Prince Charles Edward Stuart and his Jacobite army march into Glasgow. The long retreat from Derby has been a psychological blow, but this rising isn't over yet. Joined by fresh recruits from the Highlands and long-awaited French regulars, the Jacobites are about to field their largest and most dangerous force of the entire war. My name is Lee Gugino, and I'm joined by Doctors Alex Burns and Andrew Bamford. Welcome back to another episode of Prime and Load. Today, we continue our series on the Jacobite Rising. We're looking at the fascinating moment where momentum seems to swing back in the direction of the Jacobites. To help us break down this resurgence and the storm-swept battle that followed, we're joined once again by our friend Dr. Arran Johnston. Together, we follow the army's refitting at Glasgow, their Siege of Stirling Castle, and the last major Highland victory of the war. Thank you for joining us for the Battle of Falkirk. Dr. Arran Johnston, you're back and we're here to talk about Jacobites again. Could you give us kind of a short recap of where we are at currently in our story?
So last time we went from the sort of apparent high point of the Jacobite army and its victory at Prestonpans through to its decision at the end of October 1745 to lead an army into England after the ultimate Jacobite goal, of course, of restoring the House of Stuart by securing the capital in England. And that march to London, which got them as far as Derby in the English Midlands, before a pretty heated and divisive council of war, when a lot of the senior Jacobite officers faced up to a reality that the odds against being able to reach London in safety and actually secure it seemed so apparently high. In the wake of which, the Jacobite army turned about 120 miles from London, the closest it was going to get in this campaign, and began a retreat back in its own footsteps. And obviously the challenges of retreating through now potentially hostile territory in the depths of winter back towards the border. So it looks like the Jacobites are in the retreat, have lost their momentum, and have lost their best chance at securing their ultimate goal. So we left them in a pretty sticky situation there.
So we've talked a lot about the Jacobite position. King George, March Wade, what are they thinking at this time period? You know, they're getting this Jacobite army out of England. What is going through their minds?
Well, the first thing is I think there is an acknowledgement that they've just come through a very, very dangerous moment, and that it should never have been allowed to happen. In all sorts of ways. But the idea that an army that they have been very dismissive about in their propaganda had been able to penetrate so far into England and back again without being stopped was a challenge. But they have done what needed to be done. They have successfully pushed it out. There is no longer a direct threat to London from the Jacobites themselves. There might still be a threat from over the sea, however, and so there is now the priority is pushing the troops whilst you've got the operation at Carlisle, which Cumberland makes great play of, issues new promotional medals and so on for the recapture of the city, to trumpet the fact that the Jacobites have been defeated, but also what now starts to happen is a build-up of forces that are funneled towards Edinburgh, building the army which is now going to finish the rebellion off. Henry Hawley is sent up to Edinburgh to take command of the forces that are building up there. And that becomes the focus now, is the army that Hawley gathers at Edinburgh, and the Jacobites themselves just up the Forth at Stirling. Jacobites decide to besiege Stirling Castle. The town surrenders with ease, with no resistance, and they lay siege to Stirling Castle, which is a hugely significant fortress, very powerful, formidable fortress. No easy task to take Stirling at any period of its history, and certainly a tough nut from the perspective of the Jacobites. But nevertheless, a fortress that, if it were to fall, would be a serious blow psychologically in Scotland, but also materially in terms of its significance as an arsenal and a strategic outpost. And so there isn't a lot of time to hang about during this period. If Stirling Castle is under siege, you have to relieve it. And so the decision is pretty much made by the Jacobites settling down with 9,000 men outside Stirling, that you have to go in and disrupt that. So that's the situation. Henry Hawley is extremely experienced, considered extremely capable, and the forces that he's assembling in Edinburgh are different in character from General Cope's army, for example. If we think back to our Preston Pans episode, where those were considered to be troops that hadn't been on the battlefield in any recent years, and were stretched in terms of their resources and capacities. Henry Hawley has a field force with cavalry, with infantry, with artillery that is numerically the same as the Jacobites, more or less, at this point. And so if you could dismiss previous setbacks as being military mistakes and blame it on the inadequacies of the soldiers that you had, all of those excuses have now gone, and serious results are now expected. It's time to put an end to something that should never have been allowed to break out of the Highlands.
So just to get a lay of the land here, we've got a Jacobite army outside of Stirling, and they're looking to capture this crossroads. And so how does that action go for them?
Well, for anybody who's listening who hasn't seen Stirling Castle, it's quite an extraordinary position. It's very, very similar in a way to Edinburgh. It is this big volcanic crag that rises up out of otherwise pretty flat landscape. And the medieval castle, come Renaissance palace, come 18th century fortress, has developed on the top of that rocky crag, dominating the town below it. Like Edinburgh Castle, it had been considerably strengthened after previous Jacobite risings, so it is fronted by basically modern artillery defences, and there isn't a single spot within artillery range that overlooks those defences. So it's very, very strong. But equally similarly to Edinburgh Castle in 1745, it isn't particularly well stocked and supplied, and is potentially vulnerable to a long blockade. And so taking it isn't impossible. But it is a big challenge for a Jacobite army that doesn't have large amounts of heavy artillery and doesn't have large amounts of engineering expertise within the army. The key is obviously therefore time. So the Jacobites settled down. They dispersed the army in an arc around Stirling, and I think, to a considerable extent, part of this is a provocative move intended to bring Henry Hawley to them, so that they can have another confrontation. So the Jacobite headquarters is established at a place called Bannockburn, which is obviously a place loaded with Scottish symbolism already. And Charles Edward at Bannockburn House prepares a battlefield south of Stirling at a place called Plean Moor, and they are expecting Hawley there from about the 15th of January. And every day the Jacobite army forms up on that moor, ready to receive Hawley's army. So they've chosen a battlefield. They've got themselves in position. There's a force of about 1,000 men under the Duke of Perth that are kept allocated to the siege works, and the rest are brought to Plean Moor every morning. And every morning they get there, there isn't an army to fight, because, as I said, Hawley isn't rushing into their arms at this point. And the Jacobites start to get a little bit concerned about this, because every time they form the army up and it's a false alarm, it takes a little bit longer than it did the day before, and people are less urgently responding to the summons, shall we say. So there is concern at this point. There is also a press for a confrontation, because at this time Charles Edward receives confirmation that Carlisle has fallen and been retaken by Cumberland's forces. So there's not only some bad news, which Charles Edward is disheartened by, but nevertheless it's an encouragement to get a quick outcome in the current campaign, because what you don't want is all of those resources that are now freed from the north of England coming back up into Scotland. There is an attempt, actually, by the Jacobites to be aggressive at this point towards Hawley. Hawley moves a forward depot to Linlithgow, which is about halfway between Stirling and Edinburgh, and a force under Lord George Murray is detached to go and rough it up. But General Husk and the advanced guard of Hawley's army moving out of Edinburgh arrives there pretty much the same time as Lord George Murray did. So they end up shouting sweary words at each other across the River Avon, rather than engaging in anything more aggressive than that. And the Jacobites back up to Plainmoor. But it shows again that they're not just sitting on their hands; they are actively trying to create situations, to exploit opportunities, and to show that they're still basically setting the pace for events. Nevertheless, as inevitably in this circumstance, Hawley does have to come up to relieve Stirling, or at least to oblige the Jacobites to move off, and so he moves his forces up to Falkirk, occupies the town itself, and is half a day from the Jacobites' chosen battlefield at Plainmoor. But he doesn't go any further than that. He camps on the western side of Falkirk and waits. And the Jacobites, having heard this news from Carlisle, and the Prince Charlie, looking at the slowness of each day's forming up, and the potential frustration, damage of losing the initiative and now sitting on their back heels waiting for the enemy to come, decides to attack. Rather than having chosen the battlefield and waiting for the enemy to come to it, it seems to be pretty much an on-the-field decision made by the Prince and Lord George Murray and a couple of other senior officers on Plainmoor with the army formed up. There's a number of Jacobite accounts that where the authors obviously are not aware of what's coming, and they describe it basically as that the army is formed up in its battle line, and then the order is given, everybody face to your right, and the army is marched off the moor and off towards Falkirk. So I think it is a decision that is made there on the field, and the decision is taken to attack, and this is on the 17th of January. Now, I think I've expressed a number of times before, but I'm going to say it again anyway. The Jacobites are very good at planning these sorts of march. They were very careful about how they arranged their marches, and they were very well executed. For an army that doesn't have a large professional staff, they do this sort of thing very, very well. They did it particularly well, for example, in the march from Edinburgh to the border on their way down, successfully deceiving as to where they were going. And they do it again in the march from Bannockburn to Falkirk. They divide the army into two, and they take two different routes to the same location. One of which is consciously visible to the enemy, one of which is not. So off they go. Now they have a significant river, the Carron, to cross before they get to Stirling. To Falkirk. It's a notoriously bad ford anyway, but they have to do it, and it's bad weather. It's poor weather. It has been for weeks now. But nevertheless, they By dividing the army like this and having half of it marching out of sight and the other half, which includes, and they've done this before as well in the run-up to Prestonpans, which includes the prince's standard, even though he himself isn't there, fixes the attention of every watching spyglass from Hawley's picket lines. And what they see is a relatively small detachment under Lord John Drummond with the cavalry, and they observe it, and they know that it's moving. But the Jacobites have done the old Hollywood tactic of leaving their campfires burning up on the moor and so on, and so they buy themselves a little bit of time with the way that they use deception on that march. The whole army reconvenes at the ford at Dunipace, and there's a really interesting moment in that march. Now, in the wake of everything we've talked about, from the crisis amongst the senior officers at Derby and the fallouts amongst some of the relationships and personalities involved in that, there's a moment in this march that is quite revealing, where everybody is sort of forced to work together quite effectively because of the stakes of the circumstances. We get this description of Charles Edward and his senior command party moving between the two columns so that they can stay equidistant to both and stay in communication. John Sullivan, who's usually he's an Irish officer with some French experience, very close to the Prince, Adjutant General, he suddenly has concerns that the army is going to try very close to the enemy, probably within sight of their scouts, to cross a ford that is, as I say, already a notoriously difficult ford to get across, and it leaves them in a very vulnerable position for that operation. So the afternoon is wearing on, and so he suggests, actually, would it be better to do this at night? Let's get the army to the ford and then wait, and then go when we can't be observed. So he has this sort of moment of hesitation and concern, which he communicates to the Prince. Now, the Prince is often accused of always listening to his Irish advisors. Doesn't on this occasion. He summons the other officers around. Lord George Murray, in particular, at this instant, says, rather than get to the ford and then stop when they know we're there, it'd be much better just to keep pushing on. And Brigadier Stapleton, who's in charge of the French forces that have come over, he's consulted too, and this sort of in the saddle consultation takes place, and they make the decision to cross the ford and pursue up to Falkirk. So in itself, it's a small incident, but it's one of those little incidents that is sufficiently well described to give us an insight into how some of the decisions are being made. But it also allows us to challenge the really casual assumptions as to the fact that Charles Edward always listens to the Irish advice of people like Sullivan, and is cutting out and shutting out people like Lord George Murray in the wake of the decisions at Derby. There is still a lot, by necessity as much as anything else, of course, but there is still a very consultative sort of element to the Jacobite command. The result of all this is that the Jacobite army reaches Falkirk Moor before Hawley has really appreciated their intention. Falkirk's a pretty small town in 1745, but it is overlooked by a quite high moor, a large open moor on its south side, and that's the Jacobites' target. They have some very good local intelligence, including the Earl of Kilmarnock, who is with the Jacobites, and Kilmarnock owns an estate on the other side of Falkirk, so they have no trouble in terms of knowing this landscape. They know exactly where they're going. And they want to get up onto the high moor, of course, because it dominates the town. It's high, and it overlooks both the town and therefore Hawley's camp. And Hawley's initial assumption is, once he's detected that the Jacobites are indeed heading there with their full force, is that they're probably trying to bypass his camp and swing round the south side to secure the roads back to Edinburgh and recover the capital. So I don't think even at this stage he's fully realised that the Jacobite intention is for a full-scale engagement. But we end up by about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. With the sky already starting to get dark, it's but once you pass 4 o'clock on a January evening in Scotland, as I can well attest from looking out my windows, it's pretty dark. And to make matters worse, it's starting to rain as well, and a strong wind is getting up. These are not ideal conditions for a march, let alone a battle. But Hawley senses and detects that the Jacobites are indeed moving up onto the moor. He doesn't want them on the moor. There is a sort of a high ridge. Ridge is too strong a word on it, but there is a sort of a line of high summit across the centre of the moor. And Hawley detaches his dragoons to go and secure that to block the Jacobites any further progress. He succeeds in doing that. The dragoons get up onto that high point before the Jacobite army does. But the problem is that between Hawley's infantry camp and the moor itself, where the dragoons are now deploying, there is a line of very steep embankments that the infantry have to climb. And as I say, it's getting dark, the storm's brewing, and it's once they're up on that moor that the British army suddenly realises that the Jacobites are here in full strength and deploying for a battle. So this is the preparations now for the Battle of Falkirk, which is the largest battle that is fought in the campaign, and in a lot of ways the most dramatic, I think.
Could I ask? Can you talk a little bit of the composition of Hawley's army? Are these regiments that were kind of left over from Prestonpans, left in Scotland? Have there been reinforcements sent by sea? What does the army consist of? Is it mostly regular troops? I mean, I think we talked last time about second line troops and provincial units being raised. I mean, what does the army look like under Hawley's command?
So he's got a good mix. He's inherited two dragoon regiments from the Battle of Prestonpans, 13th and 14th, but there weren't many infantry regiments left after Prestonpans that were intact. And so the core of his infantry is battalions that have been brought back across from the continent. So experienced, capable, and recently experienced on the battlefield, and that's obviously officers and men. He is supported though by other ancillaries as well. So he has some Highland companies that have been raised loyal to the government, and he has militia from Glasgow and Paisley, and a small contingent of enthusiastic militia raised in Edinburgh as well. So he has those as his sort of. I don't think he has a lot of hope for their capacities in a pitched fight, but they are there and are a demonstration of Scottish support for George II in quite considerable numbers. So they are there. So he's got all of those elements, but of course the core is his infantry there. So as we left the dragoons up on the hill, those two regiments and Cobhams and others were there as well. So that even the cavalry has been reinforced, but those two regiments from Prestonpans have got an opportunity to redeem themselves after their previous performance. And as luck would have it, they are up on the battlefield first, and will have that opportunity in front of the whole Jacobite army.
Hello listeners, this is Andrew. We often say that history is written by the victors, but on this show we know it's actually written by the supply lines, by the weather, and by the difficult decisions made inside the command tent. Sometimes the most interesting part of our recording session isn't the battle narrative, it's the 20-minute debate or analysis we have between the key actions. If you enjoy those what-if moments, I invite you to become part of the Prime and Load War Room on Patreon. For the price of a pint, you can hear the conversations that usually end up on the cutting room floor. You'll also get access to our newsletter, The Orderly Book, as well as exclusive bonus episodes that cover topics we typically don't get to on the main show. So if you're the kind of person who's looking for more 18th century warfare, join the Prime and Load War Room at patreon.com/primeandload.
And can we talk about the Jacobite force a little bit as well, or at least the contingent that we've picked up since we've gotten back into Scotland? We've talked a little bit about them, but who are they exactly?
Yeah, so now we've got some fairly large regiments that have been recruited in the northeast, the northeast of Scotland, which the further up you go starts to border towards Highland in character, but is essentially all outside of the Highland line, and so this is relatively prosperous parts of Scotland, and as I've said, parts of Scotland which have strong Episcopalian traditions and have been natural recruiting grounds for Jacobite support in the past. So these are really important parts of the country for Jacobite recruitment, but they are lowland regiments in character. So they are not recruited through clan kinship ties, and yes, you've still got landlords raising their tenants, but in a structure that is much less straightforward for achieving that as in the Highlands. And part of that it manifests itself in slightly more aggressive recruiting tactics, or at least more instances of reported aggressive, threatening recruiting tactics. But nevertheless, what we end up with is some pretty large regiments like Ogilvy's regiment, Lord Lewis Gordon's, and so on. Both in those instances commanded by fairly young, enthusiastic Jacobite officers. Young landlords, junior noblemen, raising their tenants and neighbours. They are supported by the arrival, as I mentioned, of Lord John Drummond, and the regiments that have finally set foot in Scotland from France, who start to arrive from the end of October 1745. So too late to be involved in the England campaign, but now have their opportunity. I'm sure Andrew wants to come in and talk a little about them.
Yes, absolutely, I can do. I mean, we covered some of this in the St. Patrick's Day episode right back at the very beginning of the podcast, for those of you who have been here since the bitter beginning. But the French contingent, it's incomplete, I guess, is one of the first things to mention. The Royal Navy is still a presence in the North Sea, for all that the Jacobites have got control of some of the Scottish ports now. So whereas the battalion of Irish pickets is meant to be 50 picked men from each of the 6 regiments in France's Irish Brigade, only 3 of those actually make it across. Similarly, elements of the Royal Écossaise, which is the at this point notionally Scottish regiment in French service, it gains an awful lot of Scots recruits as a result of everything ultimately going wrong for the Jacobites. But it's been fairly newly raised with a cadre from the Irish Brigade, and Scots exile officers for the most part, but also commissions given to men who are still in Scotland in the hope that they'll be able to raise men to complete it to strength. There's a mythical 2nd Battalion that some people will tell you about, which may have been an idea on paper, but bearing in mind half of the original battalion doesn't actually make it across the sea and ends up in captivity. Certainly, anybody that they do pick up gets used to fill the ranks rather than to raise a new subunit. But you've got 150, 200 Irishmen, few more Scots, maybe about 400 or 500 French regulars. Certainly, in the case of the Irish, they're fresh from or relatively fresh from the victory at Fontenoy, so they've seen the British Redcoats run fairly recently, so their morale is fairly high. It's perhaps unfortunate that because they're trained troops and will do what they're told, I guess, in a way that the Scots Volunteer Army won't always do. They do get saddled with a lot of the siege work around Stirling, and actually a large portion of the Royal Écossaise is actually left there as part of the covering force that's to keep up the blockade. So yeah, what you basically got there, as far as we're concerned, for Falkirk, is a composite battalion with 3 companies of Irish, and then a picket and the Grenadier Company from the Royal Ecossoise. Brilliantly depicted on the cover of my book about the French of the 45. It's a lovely painting, and you can even see me in there in my former reenactment guise. So yeah, that's probably far more than you wanted to hear about the French contingent, but I am rather fond of them. So there we go.
So asking for an American audience that maybe is a little bit less familiar with this, Aaron, you've said this is the largest battle, or maybe 8,000 men on each side. How large are we talking?
Yeah, exactly that. About 8,000 men on each side. Now, if we think back to Prestonpans, we had 2,500 on each side. These are not big battles in a European context, but they are pretty big battles in a Scottish context, certainly. And the size is irrelevant, I suppose, in the sense that Prestonpans is a small battle, but there's only one field army in Scotland you've got to beat at the time. So that's all you need to do. But yeah, this is the Jacobite army as big as it will get in one place during the course of this conflict, and I suppose it's also important to recognise that it has suddenly leapt up in size. I mean, the move from 5,000 to 8 or 9,000 is considerable. In terms of the sudden strain on your staff and logistics, in an army like this that doesn't have large staffs of experienced men, and it has only grown in the last few days before the Battle of Falkirk. So there hasn't been a lot of time for all of these elements of the Jacobite army to integrate into an agreement, and you sort of see this in that there are some elements. Retrospectively after the battle, where some Jacobite officers are saying they weren't really sure whose command certain elements of the battle lines belonged to, and I think that is just because all of these regiments have arrived, within the last few days. The other element of the Jacobite army that we haven't really spoken about much at all is their cavalry. And that is partly because the Jacobite cavalry doesn't get a lot of attention generally because it's all of the units are in relatively small numbers. There's a couple of squadrons of lifeguards, the sort of gentleman elite, Balmerino's troop and Lord Elcho's, who've already mentioned. They've got the Scotch Hussars or Bagot's Hussars, depending on who's referring to them, who've done some actually pretty impressive work and will go on to do continually some impressive work as reconnaissance and so on. And other small units, Kilmarnocks and Strathallans, Perthshire men, and so there are small mounted units in the Jacobite army who, as I say, are primarily used for reconnaissance and so on. But at Falkirk, this is the first time that the Jacobites have deployed their cavalry onto the battlefield, which is noteworthy, if not particularly exciting, considering their potential combat capabilities. So the Jacobite army deploys very interestingly, taking on all of those elements. Its front line is dominated is exclusively Highland units. The Highlanders are deployed in the front line. The second line behind them is the Lowland units, including the Athol Brigade, who've been there from almost the very beginning, but also incorporating Ogilvies and Gordons and so on, who've just come in from the northeast, and are quite substantially numbered. The Jacobite army now is sort of 50-50 Highland and Lowland, so it's much more of a national force, if you want to put it in those terms, than it had been, for example, at Prestonpans. And then the third line that's deployed at Falkirk is basically a sort of loose spread collection of that composite battalion under Stapleton that Andrew referred to, of the French troops, and the Jacobite cavalry. So that's the intention, the sort of the battlefield system essentially that they adopt is to use the shock power of the Highlanders in the front line, backed up by the musket-armed Lowlanders, of course, behind, and then the regulars and the cavalry, to a lesser extent, are kept back behind the lines to plug the gaps and exploit the opportunities. So that's the deployment. The way I put that, I would correct myself. I'm not implying that there are not muskets on the front line. Of course, the vast majority of the Highland troops are musket armed as well. They just aren't expected to go toe to toe in a protracted firefight. So that's the way that the Jacobite army deploys up on the moor, and Charles Edward this time, unlike at Prestonpans where he was on foot in the second line, he's now mounted, obviously commanding an army of 8,000 or so men. Is a much more complex operation than 2,500, and he's on a more complicated landscape here as well. Lord George Murray is essentially given the right of the Jacobite army, commanding from the front of the right, and the left is a little bit more unclear in terms of who's actually in command on the left, that is largely because it should be the Duke of Perth, and the Duke of Perth has been left behind to oversee the siege at Stirling. And so he had been at Prestonpans, for example, the other divisional commander on the front line, opposite Lord George Murray. So his absence is actually a gap that isn't obviously filled. It is clearly intended that it's his brother, Lord John Drummond, who's filling that role. That's what I think most of those on the battlefield thought was happening. But Lord George Murray certainly accuses Drummond of having been with the Prince for much of the battle, rather than in post over on the left. But what we do get is snapshots of things like John Sullivan riding over to the right, first of all, to arrange the deployment there, and then riding along the front line, checking on all of the regimental officers as they go, detecting that there was a problem on the left as he goes, because there is a ravine cutting into the moor just ahead of the Jacobite left, and there is a danger that ravine would prohibit them from launching an attack. Now he's just warning Cameron of Lochiel and some of the Highland chiefs about this potential issue on the left, when he's suddenly told that part of the right is redeploying and reshuffling around, and Lord George Murray was shortening the frontage of some of his units there. And so he rushes back off to the right to go and see what's happening over there. And so there is this sense, and you're trying to build a picture from little snapshots. There is this sense that the Jacobite army is, now that it's got there, is shuffling around and is still trying to adjust to this to how it deploys on the battlefield. The problem they've also got now, of course, is that they are now shuffling their deployments with a large body of enemy horse in front of them, and they are on the summit, and obviously the longer that everybody sits on the top of that moor, the more British regiments are going to be fed up to it. And so without a great deal of delay, the Jacobite army is ordered to advance. And so we have this extraordinary beginning to the Battle of Falkirk, where the Jacobite line advances up the reverse slope towards the line of the ridge, which is occupied by the Dragoons. And the Highland, what we have is infantry attacking cavalry, essentially, at this point. The Dragoons are holding the top. They stay still, and the Jacobites obviously they halt just in front of the Dragoons, and the Dragoons are primarily in front of Lord George Murray's men here, and the Dragoons then start to try and encourage the Jacobites into a Highland charge, because obviously what they want to be able to do is charge themselves into disordered ranks. And what they want the Highlanders to do, these ill-trained barbarian banditti of the north, is get them all to fire off their muskets totally ineffectively, and then the Dragoons can counterattack. And the Jacobites don't take the bait. It's a very good example of the discipline that the Jacobite army is capable of. Not that it exploits all the time, but it's certainly capable of it, and does it very efficiently here. The Jacobite front line holds its fire, and it holds its fire in front of all of the provocations and dummy charges that the Dragoons present in front of them, and they advance. And then it's only when they advance into very close range that the Jacobite army opens fire, and you get these descriptions of this blistering fire that comes from the Highlanders at the very same moment as the Dragoons determine that they have to charge. And then we have an entangled hand-to-hand combat between the Dragoons and the Clandonald regiments on the Jacobite right. And the fabulously vivid descriptions of Highlanders getting underneath the bellies of the horses with their broadswords and dirks to attack the horses, punching them on the nose with the broadsword to create the panic and the fear. And not only do they hold their own position and break the impetus of that late charge, but they essentially force the Dragoons into such a panic that they break and they rout off to their right, and then as they go down, they basically many of them, those that retreat backwards, go straight back into units like those Glasgow and Paisley units that are rushing up to the battlefield from the back and panic and confuse those. But those that, rather than doing that, turn to their right, end up routing across the whole length of the frontage of the Jacobite army, and of course, inevitably, suffer fire all the way along the line. So that's a remarkable moment, and a lot of the Jacobite officers in their narratives afterwards refer to the singular and extraordinary combat, and the sort of unexpected nature of this fight. These are the two regiments that had been at Preston Pans, of course. Shugborough Whitney, who'd survived although wounded at Preston Pans, and then had been in captivity, and then had subsequently managed to rejoin his regiment. He's killed at this phase of the battle at Falkirk. So the Dragoons are broken. They have at least provided one service, though, in that in their rout across the length of the front line, they had induced the Jacobites to fire their muskets. So over on the Jacobite left, the firepower of the Highland front lines has already been unleashed, and this coincides with the first infantry moving up onto that field. Because of the nature of the way that they've deployed, in terms of where Corley's camp was, the infantry are predominantly coming up towards the Jacobite left, and so you now get a very interesting change in the flow of events. Having broken the Dragoons, the right flank of the Jacobite front line rushes to exploit that opportunity, pursues, and crashes into all the subsequent units that are trying to struggle up the hill behind the Dragoons that have been disordered by them, and so on, and even clashes with a few unfortunate spectators that have been stumbling up to the moor to see what's going on. But essentially, that very successful, very disciplined first action has been followed up by a total loss of command and control on the Jacobite right, because once that charge has begun, it's impossible to, it seems, to rein it back in. And that's Lord George Murray's. He can get the credit for the discipline of the first phase. He also has to get some of the blame for the indiscipline of the second phase. The problem is that action also sucks in the units that are on the right of the second line, because they are there to follow up and exploit the advantage that's been created for them, but off they go. Even Elcho's lifeguards from the third line seem to go galloping off in excited pursuit. Now, that might not be a problem if we were facing the same situation as we were at Preston Pans, where the whole British line goes at the same time. But that's not what we've got. Over towards the left of the Jacobite line, the infantry battalions that are coming up the hill at Buntaskin from Hawley's camp are coming up under the shadow of the protection of that ravine that Sullivan had noticed earlier on. Which means that they are coming up actually, and they're now looking at the charging clansmen from the front line of the Jacobite left, which has surged off in pursuit of the Dragoons that had run in front of them. And so they are now checked, those Highlanders, by fire coming up in front of them and from the side. And this is a very dangerous moment, and the Highlanders don't break, but they roll backwards because they are now stuck in a position where they are totally exposed, unable to charge, have lost their momentum and their order, and are now potentially being enfiladed as well. And so they fall back. They fall back into the enthusiastic men of the second line that thought they were going to be following up in triumph with the charge. And so there's a great deal of disorder suddenly on the Jacobite left. And I think they are saved initially by the fact that the weather conditions are so appalling that the initial British volleys on that side of the field don't seem to have been particularly effective. It is now full-on rain and sleet with howling winds as well. So not exactly ideal conditions for musketry. But essentially what you now have is a collapse on the Jacobite left, which of the front line, which starts to carry with it parts of the Jacobite second line. And there should have been absolutely enough intact regiments of the second line to stop this being a problem, but so many of those towards the right have followed off Lord George Murray and the success. So this is a serious moment of danger for the Jacobite army, where it's really dividing. Half of it thinks it's won the battle, half of it thinks it lost the battle. And at this crucial moment, doing exactly what needed to be done and exactly what the system was there to do, Charles Edward intervenes and directs Stapleton and the regulars to come up onto the left and plug the gap and deter the British infantry on the Jacobite left from exploiting the opportunity that they've got by being able to go toe-to-toe towards that end of the battlefield. At the same moment, Charles Edward personally rides up amongst the second line, and he, with the ability that he has as in the role that he has as the glue that holds this whole army together, and as the head of their cause in Scotland, is able to rally a considerable number of the units, both Highland and Lowland, in that mix. And it's clear that it's Charles Edward that does that. He's probably the only person on the field who has the capacity to be able to do that. And there's a description or two of the men that have just thrown down their muskets in expectation of running, sort of sheepishly picking them back up again and turning back around and moving back up into position. So there's an very important stabilization job that Charles Edward is doing, while Stapleton is plugging the gap with the regulars. The rallying of units on that Jacobite left also succeeds in discouraging a body from Cobham's Dragoons who looked like they were the Jacobites. Certainly Sullivan seems to think that they had seen the prince and decided that a good old cavalry charge up there could potentially knock him out. Whether or not they intended to or not is less clear, but certainly that's what some of the Jacobites thought they were intending to. But when they saw formed bodies of the second line recovering and moving over to the left, they decided to abandon that attempt if they'd even thought about it. So there's an awful lot that's happened there. You've seen the Jacobite right be extremely disciplined and then extremely indisciplined in its success. You've seen the Jacobite left, when the charge is initially forced to falter after a success at the outset, isn't able to stand in the face of disciplined musketry and breaks. And the units in the second line that had not been engaged get swept away in that fear as well. But it's the involvement of the prince directly and having the extra support of those regulars that are able to salvage the situation on the left. As a result of all of that, And this is not a simple battle. It is complicated to disentangle all of the accounts of these men from both sides who are fighting in very poor conditions in the dark, in a slightly confusing landscape where it's pretty much nowhere possible to have a view of every point on the line. So it is difficult to entangle exactly what is happening right across the line. But the net result is a large portion of Henry's army is either running from the battlefield or is now withdrawing. And certainly, unlike Prestonpans, a good portion of Hawley's army are able to withdraw in good order off the battlefield. Neither side, I should add, just as a final point, really, had managed to get its artillery trains up onto the battlefield in time for the action. They both had them trundling up onto the moor, but neither of the two artillery trains actually got up there on the moor to fire a shot. And of course, all of the artillery Henry Hawley had on the field was abandoned as the army began its retreat. So it hadn't been clean, it hadn't been pretty, but it was unmistakably a victory for the Jacobite army.
Arran, what can you tell us about the casualties on either side? Did the Dragoons lose heavily in the face of this disciplined fire from the first line, or what's the breakdown there?
So overall, the British Army casualties are similar to those at Prestonpans. So you're in the scope of 300 or 400. It's both sides are pretty confused about their casualties, to be honest. In the wake of it, it takes several days for Hawley to really have an understanding of what's happened. The Jacobites are very uncertain how much damage they've inflicted on the British Army. They just don't know. They can't work it out, and that obviously influences the decisions in the immediate wake of the attack. Hawley, if you want to measure these things in material senses as well, loses his baggage train, his encampment, and his artillery. So it's very difficult to put a sort of good face on that. But he extricates his army more or less intact, and the army gets off the field. It has been badly blooded. Parts of it haven't performed particularly well. The 13th and 14th Dragoons have not exactly extricated themselves out of the Black Book yet, and they're not going to be given many more opportunities to do it for some years. But it had been a very messy affair. But the casualty numbers aren't particularly high. Jacobite numbers are much lower, but again, it's not really about the casualties for the Jacobite army so much as the fact that they are now dispersed over quite a large area, because the right wing has followed up a considerable distance towards Falkirk, and parts of the left have streamed all the way back to the ford at Dunipace, including some fairly senior officers, which is somewhat concerning. So there are several miles separating some of the Jacobite units by the end of the night. So there's a lot of disorder on the moor in the final stages of the battle. And Charles Edward is not able to rapidly and efficiently rally and reform enough men to be able to immediately launch anything beyond the capture of the camp and the town. So the opportunity or the idea of launching any sort of pursuit to harass Hawley on the retreat is gone, even if there had been the desire to do it on such a night as that.
And what would you say is the strategic aftermath of this battle? So we've got Hawley is driven from the field. The Jacobites, although not pretty, have won another one. Where does this put them strategically?
Well, it gives them a number of options. In a sense, they have the chance to potentially, if they move quickly, and if they perceive that Hawley's forces are in any sort of disarray, to exploit it and potentially threaten Edinburgh again. Alternatively, however, and this is the more conservative approach that they end up going with, they've cleared themselves the space to seriously prosecute the siege of Stirling Castle. And they've bought themselves some time to do that. There are a number of factors that feed into the decisions in the immediate aftermath. Firstly, of course, the physical dilution of the Jacobite army across this battlefield and the difficulties of reassembling it. So crucial hours are lost on the first night itself. The weather, of course, not helping. And the fact that the Jacobite army had been stood in arms since 9 or 10 o'clock that morning, it's now 7 or 8 o'clock at night by the time they've secured Falkirk. The men need shelter. They need to get off the moor. They need supplies and food. So on the day itself, there's no capacity to make any decisions beyond immediately securing Falkirk and trying to get some shelter. Charles Edward sends words back to Dunipace to find any officers there and get them to Falkirk the following morning. And we have this fascinating scene described to us by one of the Edinburgh volunteers, John Hume, who later became a historian and wrote a very influential history of the conflict. Who'd been there. He was at Prestonpans. He was at Falkirk. He decided not to bother carrying on his military career from this point onwards. But he describes being a prisoner taken down to Callander House and reviewed and processed there. But that was also Charles Edward's headquarters for the night, having been Hawley's headquarters the previous day. And so he says there were all the prisoners lined up in the garden at Callander House with a lovely view of the prince waving at the window, So there were prisoners to deal with. There was artillery to recover from the battlefield. There were bodies to clear and find, of course. There is still the siege to prosecute. So Charles Edward, once it's clear that there's no support for an immediate march on Edinburgh, he himself moves back to Bannockburn. And then I think he makes possibly his first actual, real, genuine mistake in the way that he commands the army. He allows it to remain divided. So the Highland units with Lord George Murray are left at Falkirk on the ground that they've just secured, of course, and as the vanguard to forewarn of any further attempts by Hawley to come back. And the Lowland units are moved up to Stirling to support the siege operation there. And what he has essentially done, inadvertently, I'm sure, is cede command of all those Highland units to Lord George Murray, who now spends the following week or two debating the strategic situation with the clan chiefs there without the prince present. And the other compounding factor in this is that Charles Edward falls quite seriously ill at this point. And after a brief visit to the siege batteries that are being erected at Stirling, where he spends a few hours reviewing the trenches, he then goes back to Bannockburn House and falls sick. Now, he gets criticised for falling sick at this crucial juncture. I'm not sure anybody chooses when they get to fall sick, but I think it is important to recognise the vast amount of pressure that this young man has been under since the previous July, and the almost all of which he was completely unprepared for in any mental psychological way, but also the massive physicality of what the Jacobite army has undertaken since it left the Highlands the previous summer. So it's not surprising, I don't think, that people were unwell at this point, and so there's been a lot of discussion as to whether the prince's illness at Bannockburn House is fully physiological, or whether it's psychosomatic, or a combination of all of those factors. But I think his body is exhausted, and I think his mind is exhausted. And this is the first real stage since the departure from Edinburgh in October, where there isn't an immediate pressing tactical or strategic decision for him to make. And so that is the point where, if you do take your foot off the pedal, everything crashes. And I think that's what's happened. And so what it means is you've got the Duke of Perth overseeing the siege operations at Stirling, and you've got Lord George Murray with the Highland divisions at Falkirk, and there's not actually a lot for the prince to do in that window after the Battle of Falkirk, and that's when he crashes. So that sort of essentially yields for the first time, I think it's fair to say, the strategic initiative a little bit, and so what the Jacobite army is now waiting for is for the next stage. Either Stirling Castle will fall, and there were certainly some fairly loud voices in the Jacobite army casting doubt on whether that was ever achievable. As Andrew's already alluded to, a lot of Jacobite regiments are very loath to do siege work, had been seen at Carlisle, for example, where the Highlanders had simply refused to do it because it was beneath them to be digging in the mud. So it's one of the reasons why the Highland units weren't put anywhere near Stirling, because it was clear that they weren't going to be any use. But what it means is that the casualties that have been taken by the Jacobite army during the siege works are falling amongst those regular soldiers who were extremely valuable to the army and couldn't be wasted. So it's a disappointing and demoralising operation in Stirling itself, but what Prince Charlie is assuming is that at some point Hawley and the army there is going to come back, and there is an opportunity to fight the Battle of Falkirk a second time, perhaps even this time at Plainmoor, at the battlefield they had already chosen, and if they could do it once, then they could do it again. And of course, during this period, towards the end of January, the Duke of Cumberland arrives in Scotland and assumes command in Edinburgh of the British army that had been previously under Hawley. Noticeably, unlike General Cope, who was put firmly out of the front lines after his defeat at Prestonpans, Hawley is retained at Cumberland's service and doesn't suffer anything like the criticism that Johnny Cope does. But it is in the wake of Falkirk that you do detect a slightly greater respect for the Jacobite army from Cumberland and his staff. They do recognise that these are dangerous. This is a dangerous opponent, and can't be taken lightly. Having said which, as soon as Cumberland reaches Edinburgh, he has, I think, one night in the palace, and then gets the army moving again. And this is now the crisis point for the Jacobite army. They have, since they crossed the border after the march back from Derby, they have recovered their psychological control of the war, perhaps you could say. The prince has recovered his sense of command in the army itself. They've increased in numbers. They've been augmented in their capacity with artillery and with their regulars. They've got demonstrable French support in the field for the first time, and so they're in a strong position. And they've just won a very significant fight at Falkirk. And at that point, Charles Edward receives the news that the Duke of Cumberland has reached Edinburgh, and he sends, snapping out of his illness at Bannockburn, he sends a message to Falkirk, and he says for Lord George Murray to be ready with the Highland units to hold Falkirk. And Charles Edward, at the first confirmation that Cumberland leaves Edinburgh, Charles Edward will bring the rest of the army down from Stirling to meet Murray at Falkirk for the next battle. He sends that message with John Sullivan and Murray of Broughton, and they go into Falkirk. They speak to Lord George Murray, and they are slightly suspicious that Lord George Murray, who does not like either of them, is extremely polite to them. They should have been suspicious. He says, okay, everything's fine, everything's in order here, and sends them back. That night, after the prince has gone to bed, a letter arrives from Murray and the other chieftains at Falkirk, saying that they have held their council of war, and they have decided that in the wake of the victory at Falkirk, significant numbers of men have retired home, and that the army is therefore in no position to offer battle to the Duke of Cumberland. They therefore say that the army must make preparations to not only retreat from Falkirk, but to abandon the siege at Stirling and withdraw to the Highlands. Now, there seems to have been absolutely no preparatory discussion about this that the prince was involved in at all. And there's in Sullivan's account particularly, you get this description of the letter arriving and Sullivan and Murray standing in the corridor with it in their hands saying, "Oh my God, who's going to take this in and show it to the prince?" Because I think Sullivan's words are, "This will set him mad." And so they decide to do it when he wakes up in the morning. He does react badly, as you would expect, and he sends a letter back to Falkirk, saying basically that it's an outrage, and that if he prefers, he can abandon Falkirk and consolidate back at Bannockburn, and they'll fight at Plainmoor or whatever. But this is when Charles Edward says, "Is it possible that a victory and a defeat can have the same outcome, and that the conquerors should flee before the vanquished?" Because as far as he can see, he has his army intact. He's just won a victory a couple of weeks before, and now he's being told that his army has to retreat from the same army that he's just beaten. There is a furious exchange of couriers. There's a small delegation of chieftains that come up to Bannockburn House and meet with Charles Edward. Lord George Murray does not come, I think, in order to try and keep things slightly more cool than they might otherwise have been. We have no description of what actually transpired inside the room where Keppoch and others met with Prince Charlie, but there is a letter from the following day where the prince says, "No doubt they'll have come back complaining of what I said to them last night." So he obviously wasn't particularly diplomatic in his response. And eventually it becomes clear, as had happened at Derby, that Charles Edward cannot compel them to stand in the field at this point. He writes an extraordinary letter, which is actually quite composed, but articulates his fears for what will happen next. He says that if they withdraw, they abandon the whole of the south of Scotland, which includes abandoning anybody in the south of Scotland who had expressed support or sympathy for them. He says that if they start to retreat into the Highlands because they don't think they can face Cumberland at Falkirk, what will have changed by the time they reach Perth? What will have changed by the time they reach Inverness? Are they in retreat going to suddenly become more capable of defeating Cumberland than they were at this particular moment? What will Spain and France think of us, he says, once we are retreating now, not only from our campaign in England, but now retreating in the wake of a victory and giving up everything that had been achieved so far? He says we will have less in our hands than we had at Glenfinnan when the war started, if we continue retreating from here. All of these points that he raises are absolutely valid and are vindicated by subsequent events. That is not to say, and we go back to the same arguments that he'd had in England, that is not to say that they will be successful now, but they have more chance of being successful now than they probably will have in several weeks' time. Nevertheless, he concludes by saying, "But I understand, if I can't make you do it, then I will order the retreat." And that is what happens. The orders for the abandonment of the Siege of Stirling are given, and on the 1st of February, the Jacobite army retreats back across the Firth of Forth, that symbolic barrier between northern and southern Scotland. And the retreat is not executed particularly well, and perhaps symbolic of the Jacobite army's position at this point. There is an accidental explosion at St Ninian's Church outside Stirling, where they had been storing powder, that destroys all of the church except for the steeple itself, and is indicative of a degree of misadministration in the retreat as the Jacobite army pulls out. It is a huge psychological blow to the prince to be forced into this position again. The most compelling argument Murray had come up with was that there were high degrees of desertion in the Jacobite army, but in the subsequent days, once they're over the Forth, they hold a review of the army and discover it's pretty much exactly the same size as it had been before. We are back perhaps where we started after a month of considerable recovery for the Jacobite army. It decides to go back onto the retreat. The temptation has long been to see Derby as the critical turning point, but I actually see it as being Falkirk, because you have a Jacobite army that is extremely capable and still potentially very potent. But at Falkirk, you can just about see it having strategic options. Once it retreats north of the Firth of Forth, it becomes harder and harder to see how it can actually achieve its objectives. So this is a really significant point in the conflict. And because we have a tendency to want to rush towards the finale, Falkirk often gets forgotten or skimmed over in the middle, because it's hard to discuss how the Jacobites win a battle during a period of apparently constant retreat. But it has to be seen in that context of a temporary recovery and a resurgence. And hopefully that's what this sort of conversation is doing.
That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter with a link in the description. It's the best way to stay up to date on the show, see what's coming up next, and ask us questions. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, formerly known as X. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford. It was produced by Lee Gugino, music by Brianna Tam, Artie Sun, and Adrian Berenegger. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.